All right, so I am recording this presentation for my Ed 505 application project in order to, one, provide some clarity and focus, but also for me to provide further explanation in detail to help connect the ideas and principles of UDL to the unit I've planned for this project. So the focus of this is how to implement a universal design for learning framework in unit and lesson planning in the classroom. So the project goal and purpose was for me to incorporate universal design for learning principles into an 8th grade U.S. history unit, which will focus specifically on the creation of the U.S. Constitution. The reason why I chose this topic, first the UDL principles, is because I believe it's something that's very applicable to what I'm going to be doing in the upcoming year, so it's very relevant and meaningful for me. And then two, it's something that doesn't just support learners with various disabilities, but supports all learners. I believe UDL isn't just a separate accommodation or strategy or intervention, but it's just basic best practice that all teachers should and can strive for to support all learners, even though I do believe that UDL is helpful to address and specifically help support learners with disabilities too. So what I'm hoping to accomplish, one, on a basic level, is I'm going to be teaching at a new school this upcoming year, which means I'm going to be teaching some new classes and new units, which includes 8th grade U.S. history, and one of the early units will be on the U.S. Constitution. So part of this is just hoping to start planning for the upcoming school year, but also I'm hoping to create a unit and lesson plans that will help support all learners. And considering the fact that this upcoming school year is going to be unique and we still don't quite know what that's going to look like, my school just came out with plans and there's a couple different levels of them depending on where we're at with COVID-19. So I'm hoping that UDL principles will work not just if we're in the physical classroom setting, but also if we have to do some online remote distance learning too. So what I'm hoping that you'll be able to see first is my use of multimedia and digital technology to help implement and incorporate UDL principles into this unit. And I hope you will also see kind of multiple ways for students to access information, multiple ways for students to demonstrate their learning, and then multiple options for students to engage in the learning based on their ability and their interests, which are three of the main ways that we incorporate UDL into the classroom. So hopefully you'll be able to see once again that multimedia approach with digital technology, and then the flexibility in multiple ways of representation, multiple ways of demonstrating learning, and multiple ways for students to engage based on their interests. So first, what I'd like to do before I get into my unit and lesson plans is just go through the basics of what UDL is all about. So this is a curricular and instructional design framework, and the entire point of UDL is to promote inclusion, and that's including students with or without disabilities. And based on this course and the research and the modules we've done, I think it's pretty clear that an inclusive practice is one that benefits all learners. So the goal for UDL is to provide access to curriculum for all students, whether or not they have disabilities and regardless of what types of disabilities that they may have. So the principles of UDL should be things that are woven into the fabric of the classroom, and we'll get into more detail on that in the next slide. The goal for UDL in this unit and lesson plan is that the access skills that students will need won't inhibit and prevent their ability to reach the target skills and the objectives that I have. And sometimes the target skills might be access skills, things like writing or reading or public speaking. But hopefully what you'll see in this unit and lesson plans is that a student's access skills won't interfere with their ability to master and reach the target skills that I have for them as well. And according to IDEA, students are to be taught in the least restrictive environment. They are expected to the best that we possibly can to be educated in the general classroom, and that just doesn't mean that they are physically in the general classroom drawing pictures or doing meaningless work, but their actual participation, engaging the general curriculum, is meaningful too. And once again, that's in the least restrictive environment, and that's to the most that we possibly can get, depending on the student. So the framework for UDL consists of three main components. One is multiple means of representation. So when you look at my unit and lesson plans, what I have done is highlighted the parts of the lesson plan in yellow that demonstrate ways that I've provided for multiple means of representation, which means students have various ways to acquire the information that they need. So anytime you see something highlighted in yellow, that means that there's an example of multiple means of representation. Second, multiple means of action and expression, which are choices for students to demonstrate their learning, giving them various options. I've highlighted those examples in the unit plan in green. And then the third part of the framework is multiple means of engagement, which are options based on students' interests and their abilities. And I've chosen to highlight those examples in blue. So hopefully that will help allow you to focus more specifically on examples for these three main components of representation in yellow, action and expression in green, and then engagement in blue. And also what I hope you'll see, and I didn't use any highlighting or anything like that to help point this out, but hopefully you'll just be able to observe it on your own, is the 7 key principles that are a part of Universal Design for Learning. And those are described here on the right. So the 7 main principles include equitability, flexibility, it's simple and intuitive, there are multiple means of presentation, it is success-oriented, there is an appropriate learning environment, and there is an appropriate level of student effort. Well, hopefully you'll be able to see most, if not all, of those 7 principles of UDL in this unit plan, as well as the multiple means of representation, action and expression, and engagement. One thing I did find from planning this unit, and I think it might be a little more challenging if you're teaching history as well, is finding ways for students to have that multiple means of engagement. I think it's easier to do that based on student abilities, but in history, to base it on student interest can be tricky, considering that you do have possibly a more limited scope of content to cover. When it comes to history, there are certain things that you need to teach according to state standards. The content in a lot of ways seems more defined than perhaps in other areas that may be more open-ended, but I do hope from this unit you'll find that I did provide ways for students to have multiple means of engagement, not just based on their ability, but also based on their interest levels as well. Once again, multimedia and digital technology provide wonderful tools to help make all of these things possible and to fully implement that UDL framework, and I hope you'll be able to see that very clearly based on the various activities that I have in my unit and lesson plans. Here are the references that I used for this presentation and the references that I used to help kind of further understand what UDL is all about, what the main framework is, the components, the principles, and then also ideas for how to approach UDL in my unit and lesson plans. So what I'm going to do is take you next to my unit and lesson plans. I apologize that it's kind of long and scattered, but please do know that I'm actually using this in the upcoming school year, and this is how I personally go about planning units and lessons. So even though it might not be the most streamlined for this project, it is created in a way that's meant to be the most practical and useful for me, which I do think was obviously a whole part of this project, is for me to personally be able to apply this, and this is how I go about it. So the first 3 pages are the basics of the unit plan, and I used a backwards design approach using Understanding by Design, which was a framework I learned back when I took the curriculum class in, I think it's Ed 504 for this program. This isn't so much the focus for this project, but I did want to include it just so it was understood what the main goals for this unit were, the understandings, the essential questions, the various assessments and performance tasks and the criteria I have for students, and then also a broad overview of their learning activities. In order for me to really show you how I used UDL principles and components in this unit plan, though, I think you'll have to focus more on the individual lesson plans that I created. So this is the template I used. It's from Van Brummelen, called Walking with God in the Classroom, which was actually a template that was given to me back when I was at Dordt College as an undergrad student, and it's something I still use to this day to plan my lessons. So what I hope you'll be able to do is focus specifically on kind of this middle part here, number 1, 2, 3, and 4, which identifies the various activities that students will be engaging in. And as you can see here, the ones where there's multiple ways for students to access the information, that's highlighted in yellow. The examples where students have multiple ways to demonstrate their learning, that's provided in green. And then if we scroll down, like I said, it was a little trickier to get multiple options for engagement. That's in blue, which is based on student interest and student ability. One cool thing that I'll have the opportunity to use for this upcoming school year, I do use a textbook sometimes in my classroom, and they'll be used in this unit too, but we don't just have the physical book, we also have an online version of the textbook too. So one cool thing about that is when I do use the textbook, I can have students use the online version, which provides various tools to help them access that information, which is an example of UDL. So for example, they can have it read for them. They can use highlighting and other annotating tools within the online textbook, and each student has their own account. They can increase the font size or decrease it. There's all sorts of pretty cool tools you can use with the online textbook that just allow students to access it in different ways and use different tools to help them do so. And one thing I've learned from, this will be my 8th year of teaching compared to my first few years, is that when it comes to teaching history, and probably any other content area too, one of the biggest struggles for students with different needs and possible learning, reading, disabilities, is it's really difficult for them to understand a textbook given how the textbook is used, and perhaps more importantly, the time frame in which it's used. For some students, it just takes longer for them to really grasp the material in a textbook. And I know in my first few years, I would give them a section of the book, they'd do a worksheet, and I expected them to have it done by the end of class. And that is not a UDL framework. So I'm hoping what you'll see here is kind of the growth in that, where students aren't just expected to understand the textbook the same way as everyone else, but there's different options for them to do that. So I tried to make a line here to separate lessons, and it says lesson plan 3, lesson plan 2, etc. There are 6 total. I would also encourage you to read the little blips of information in the personal notes, reminders, and homework section, which are little kind of descriptions of things for me to personally keep in mind specific to making sure that UDL principles are incorporated in these lessons and in this unit to support all learners. But one thing that's not included that I do think is important to mention about UDL is that since this is a unit or lesson plan, it doesn't so much talk about the physical classroom and how we need to make sure that we allow for the physical classroom to support learners with perhaps physical disabilities. It could be vision impairments, it could be orthopedic impairments and disabilities, whatever that may be. Just having this unit plan isn't enough. And also UDL in and of itself isn't the perfect kind of be-all solution to supporting all students. Certain students may require additional accommodations or additional modifications. And one of the whole key principles of UDL is flexibility. It's important to be able to use other accommodations and modifications along with UDL to support all learners. UDL just helps provide a strong base and foundation to make sure that happens, but it's not a good approach if it's the only thing you're using. Other things might be necessary too. So here's kind of my unit plan. I'm not going to go through all the details. It can be read on your own, but that's just my explanation of what this project's all about, why I chose it, what I'm hoping you'll see in it, and kind of my goals and purpose for choosing this as my application project.